what have we got today? Well, the mirror has splashed on one very lucky baby who escaped unharmed when the tent it was sleeping in at a Welsh campsite was rolled over by a car that had come off the road. More on that with eyewitness accounts inside the paper. But first, I want to take us to page 19, where the devastation of last week's wildfires on Hawaii is becoming obvious, with the body count rising as people have started picking through the debris. Now, residents are wondering how on earth they're going to rebuild or indeed find somewhere to live while they do it. Now, Sophie, the cost of all this, social and economic, is going to be simply just massive. But now it seems that there's evidence that it happened because the officials didn't want to pay to avoid it, isn't there? Take us through this story. What's it say?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a very, very difficult, sensitive story. We've got, nearly up to 5,000 people, 4,500, who are waiting to be sheltered. The death toll's now hit 93, and we're expecting that to go up more. And I mean, we've had Biden obviously declare this as a disaster, but yeah, the cost issues all around this are very difficult. People are saying that they have been requesting certain things to have helped stop the fires in their paths, including thinning vegetation or generally more disaster support, and that hasn't been coming in. And I think, as we were sort of just saying in the backstage room, that this is kind of a trend that we've been seeing across the world. We've obviously seen wildfires ravaging across Europe at the start of the summer as well. But contingency planning for climate disasters isn't catching up in the rate that we want to see. And we can even think about this with COVID. If you all saw the David Attenborough documentary just after COVID, who says, this is linked to the climate. This is what happens when you ruin certain habitats, and certain animals are impacted. And through that then means that other animals like rats and bats that can carry COVID are not eaten in the same way. There's a lot more of them, and they can carry certain diseases to humans. And this, I guess, is a global conversation around climate change and really facing up to the kind of threats that we are facing now. Wildfires are only going to get worse. And, we have a disaster being declared after the wildfires come out from Biden, but we should be declaring climate change potentially a disaster far before we have to see the impacts.
That might have been, with hindsight, the most sensible way of doing it. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that this is the kind of thing that people should be planning for and expecting to happen? The mitigation of the climate problems has to happen before you can fix it. You can't just switch off oil or gas tomorrow and the environment goes back to normal on Wednesday. It takes years to settle down again. So you are going to have these issues, even if everything went well as far as going to net zero and everything is concerned. And it's not going well because exactly of the thing that Sophie's just mentioned. So what do you think people should be doing? It's almost like a microcosm of the Green debate, really. So this is a report that was written in 2014, 9 years ago, by people on Hawaii saying we're going to have wildfires and Lahaina is going to be burnt to a crisp unless we start doing some of these things. And apparently the officials at the time said, that's all rather expensive. I don't think it's necessary. So they didn't do it. And look what has befallen Lahaina. Now, it's like a microcosm of the debate that we seem to keep having here in this country, and indeed all over the developed world, which has got the wealth and the privilege and the power to pollute the rest of the world, where we talk all the time about the cost of things, about the cost of ULEZ and low emission zones, or eco heating systems, or using vegetable oil instead of kerosene. And those arguing all the time that it's too expensive and voters won't stand for this green crap and all that kind of stuff. They never once talk about the cost of not doing it, which is immense, because eventually we all end up paying these prices. John says, how can you plan for it when the Republican Party is so crazy? Fortunately, the craziness of the Republican Party sort of seems to have affected our own, and indeed some of the right-wing conservative parties all around the world. It's like a movement that can't really be stopped. But we all end up paying this price, don't we? So it's higher prices, home contents insurance, higher price of food and goods, even within our own countries, movements of people away from the danger area where you might flood or catch fire to somewhere else. So people going on, we don't want you all living here. It was nice before you turned up. People want to move away from the floodplain, away from the cliff, not next to the scrubland that can catch fire. It's the entire problem just rolled up in one tiny story.
Yeah, totally. And you obviously mentioned how this is repeated across the world, and maybe we could speak a little bit about the situation in the UK now and the debate going on there. So you mentioned ULEZ, which is the ultra low emission zone
Mm.
scheme that we've seen in London at the moment, and potentially we could see expanding it out to other cities where if you have a certain car, which is generally an older car that releases a certain amount of emissions, you have to pay something every day. It's like a tax for your car. And there was huge backlash against this. And this was basically the deciding factor in the Uxbridge by-election. So Uxbridge, Boris Johnson's old seat. There was a by-election there, and the Tories managed to cling on to it with just a few hundred votes over what they said it was a one topic sort of by-election on ULEZ. And that's what swung it. So Tories run a very anti-ULEZ kind of campaign. And it's very difficult because that's sort of opened up this debate now where everyone's sort of worried of whether we talk about green issues in the election, of how they might turn people. We have this debate around the 2030 car ban of petrol and diesel bans, which is petrol and diesel cars, which would basically see new petrol and diesel cars, the sale of them be banned. So still have second-hand cars be sold. And, Rishi has said that we're going to continue with that ban. We're still going to hit it. But he's getting lots of backlash already from people in his own party. And, once it gets closer to the time, will we see him roll back on that to sort of quell disagreements in his party? And you often see that as we're leading into elections, how to keep the peace behind closed doors among politicians, as opposed to have the public as being the priority. I have to say this is a difficult issue across the board anyway. I as a journalist, we at the Mirror do lots of green reporting, but I as a journalist, you sometimes find it difficult to find those headlines in the way that you might with other stories, because it takes time to talk about things that are imagined, and that's what green activists really want. They want us to have this shift between thinking about right now, what's the pay that I have to have on my high emissions car, and think about our imagined children, the imagined generations, and what kind of world they are going to be living in. Can we really stand up and be selfless humans, or are we too focused on the days ahead of us?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, when it comes to things like ULEZ, it is still affecting us, but it's in such a way it's invisible. You cannot see the impact that car pollution is having on your lungs or your heart or your brain or your chances of having Alzheimer's. And these things, they're not quite known yet. Some of the links aren't quite there. Some of the links are there. ULEZ, as John says, is not about the environment. It's about public health. And so when people say, it's a war on motorists, actually, it's trying to find a way that motorists and pedestrians all live a bit longer, which last time I thought about it, that's not what you call a war. Ever.
Let's look at Rishi Sunak up in his helicopter anyway, and the emissions going on there. Is he with motorists? I'm not so sure.
I'll tell you what's more on motorists is bloody potholes. And if he ever used the road as opposed to the skies, he would know how bad they are. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that there is a better change in the debate that needs to happen about this? We start talking about the cost of not doing these things. Because it comes to, like you said, Sophie, back to COVID, doesn't it? And all the lockdowns and stuff. People were talking about what we need to do to stop having the terrible imagined disaster of many, 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 many deaths. And so we did something. And then because those deaths didn't happen, some people say, well, we didn't need to do it then, did we? The reason it didn't happen is because you did the thing. And but there's still that argument as to whether the lockdowns and the vaccines and all that stuff was actually necessary, because, well, COVID didn't kill lots of people. Well, that's because we were better than every previous pandemic we've ever had. But it's kind of amazing to me, going back to this Hawaii story, that 9 years ago this was predicted. Something could have been done, but absolutely wasn't. And I can remember, Sophie, probably before you were born, 30 years ago in my geography GCSE, we were being taught about the greenhouse effect and climate change, and we were told just exactly what was going to happen. And nothing really has been done in those 30 years. So the fact it wasn't done 9 years ago as well is kind of not surprising. But I suppose it was more imagined then, like in the 80s and the 90s, whereas now there isn't time really left to say, there's not much space in which to argue that this isn't happening.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. We need action. We need it now. And I think people do really care. And you look at polling, Brits understand that this is something that's happening. We've had a rainy summer this year and everyone says, oh, well, I wish it was like last year. I think we're all getting what it like when it was 40 degrees that day in the UK. We don't have the infrastructure, so we're dealing with these kind of things, and we need to actually, sit and think about what climate change looks like in the real world right now. I think sometimes we look at disaster films and we think it means, the whole of the UK will be underwater, and right now I can still walk on the path. That means climate change is not happening. But we look around ourselves, look at these rising temperatures. Was your holiday cancelled this year? And maybe that is a way that we get through to politicians, we get through to people, and everyone to care about it a bit more. So think, what's happening in your life? How has this affected you? And look what's happening in Hawaii right now. We've seen the death toll at nearly 100 now, and it's only going to go up. And people have lost their homes, their livelihoods, they've lost everything. And just because it's happening to us right now doesn't mean we shouldn't have the ability to understand how deep that impact is, and understand that it's only going to get worse, and it might be on your doorstep before you know it.
Yeah, and it's not like we haven't been told, is it? And one of the things that's causing a lot of these, not causing, but the climate change caused a lot of problems to the developed world, where generally the weather is a bit more temperate, shall we say, not as bad as it is in equatorial regions. And so a lot of the climate change might be happening somewhere else, but the effects do still come here.